On the panel, Gillian, who presented first, for any of you who joined us late, Malcolm, who developed the tool, Mark, who's just shown you some application of it, Stephen Bishop, who's working within Steer Davis Steer, and will be able to talk a little bit about the use of the tool in terms of the consultancy application. So we'll be fielding questions from the Slido, so if you could put your questions in there now, the number is at the bottom, the link is there at the bottom of the slides, and basically I'm going to go through some of the data, some of the questions that have already been asked, and ask them of various different people. I think, Malcolm, to kick us off, because we've had so many questions about where does the data come from, when will it be updated, is it freely available, and all of those sorts of basic questions. I mean, maybe you could just sort of say out loud where the data is, maybe share it again on the chat where the tool is, and just sort of talk a little bit about updates.
Yes, so there's lots of questions there. So yes, the data is publicly available, free to use. People have got the link to the tool now, www.carbon.place, and if you click on the data tab at the top, it gives you lots more information about where the data's come. So I won't go into the specifics about every single data set. Essentially, it's a patchwork quilt of data sets. Some data is things like gas and electricity consumption is very easy to get. Myself and Gillian and others have done a lot of work on the transport data. And then some data, things like consumption of goods and services, are much harder to get really local data for. So there's a degree of modelling and downscaling national data to a local level based on survey information and information on things like household income. So it is quite a complicated patchwork quilt. Something I also didn't say in the presentation is that all the source code that was used for the analysis is also published as open source. So if you're interested in the exact weightings and methodologies and things, you can look at the source code. And I'm also very happy to take emails and things with specific technical questions. In terms of is it going to be updated, that is our hope. We don't currently have funding to update it. So at the moment, the tool represents a single snapshot for 2018. The reason we use 2018 is it's the most recent year that all the different data sets are available for. So some data sets like gas and electricity we have up to 2020 already, but some other data sets aren't updated that frequently. So 2018 is the most recent year we can do a comprehensive carbon footprint for. But the hope is that we would be able to update that in the future if we can secure additional funding. And for local authorities and things, if you like the tool, I've seen quite a few positive comments in the chat. It's really helpful if you tell us that, because then we can turn around to the funders and to national government and say this is something local authorities want and need, and that can build a case for funding.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. Gillian, could I bring you in here and just sort of say to you a little bit about you talked at the beginning about the different uses of the tool, but who are you thinking are the target audiences for this tool? I mean, obviously there are a lot of local authorities here that might use the tool in their policy development and plan development as we go forward. But how about, for example, the fact that it's quite residentially based? Is there anything, is there an intention to have just that residential focus?
I think, as I said, I think it's really, I think we can see, given the breadth of the sources of data and the different geographical scales at which you can look at it, I think it's going to be relevant for anyone that's involved in the carbon reduction agenda. So that's going to be those that are planning, those that those that are responsible for policy at local level, but also those that are interested in understanding, maybe lobbying, maybe trying to galvanise local support, whether it's from businesses or other publics, as we should say. It's obviously public engagement is a sort of meaningless term in the sense that what does it mean? Certainly we haven't yet had the opportunity to bring this tool to any kind of public engagement activity, but I think that it could be used again at very different scales. It could be used, it could be used with school children, maybe. Obviously, it's very complicated, but in terms of, basic geographical understanding of where you live and the types of activities that are going on around you and what that results in terms of relative impacts. It could be used in public consultations about whether it's housing, whether it's transport related agendas. So sorry, it's a bit of a broad term, but I think everybody can see that it's got probably lots of different things for different audiences.
That's great, thank you, Gillian. Mark, one of the questions that came up in the Slido was how do you communicate to the sort of politicians that not all areas need to be targeted, and that in fact therefore you might need to put different resources into different places, and obviously the rural areas will always be more of a challenge, but perhaps also more difficult in terms of putting in viable public transport options and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the options that might be available in that high red area that you showed in Wealden, in terms of trying to decarbonise that, where everyone's very car dependent?
Well, I think that, as we've seen, the tool is really powerful in terms of showing information visually, and obviously when communicating with some of our politicians, having the ability to show the information directly in that way is really extremely helpful. And I would also say, when we're having conversations with members of the public about our action plan development, the tool is going to be very useful in illustrating to people in particular communities why the drivers, the drivers of our action plan have to be as they are, and why there are different things that need to happen in different areas. So I think just the simple mapping of the information in this way is extremely powerful, and enables us to communicate more effectively with different audiences. As I showed in the quick exposition of an area not too far from where I live, there are some real, particularly in rural areas, there are some real challenges on the decarbonisation agenda. But as I showed, the tool does sort of point us to targeting our actions to think about those things which are, particularly in a rural context, we might have to think more about, improved digital connectivity to increase the propensity of people to work from home, and encouraging the shift to EVs. As I know that isn't part of the solution, there are other things that are needed, but in a rural context, we can see very much the high levels of car ownership that there are there. Our ability to shift to cycling and walking is far less reduced, given the distances that people have to travel. So it gives a different emphasis maybe to what we need to do in the rural areas compared to urban.
Great. Stephen, could I bring you in here and just sort of say, how would you imagine? I mean, I know that obviously Steer does a lot of work with local authorities all around the country to help them develop their transport plans. And I wondered how you could imagine sort of using the tool in that applied context.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and good morning, everyone. I think this is quite a key tool now, and I hope it can become quite ubiquitous in its use. But I think having this richness of evidence and it brought together, and some of the comparisons and trade-offs that are shown with that data is really helpful for developing the evidence basis for policy and strategy development. I think Gillian mentioned it when she had that graph of the kind of 5 times variability in carbon emissions. Having that insight at an LSOA level or different geographical scales starts to then really identify where effort should be focused. Of course, there's a role for national policy and regulation, but that idea that one size does not fit all, which I think takes into perhaps the most important areas with community engagement. There were some questions on the Teams chat as well about what can we do to galvanize public buy-in, to remove some of those barriers to change. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm a bit of a geek, but we all love maps, and I think a lot of people are probably already typing in home postcodes or other things like that. I think these sorts of tools can really focus people's attention and effort. There's almost a bit of a gamification to it. No one wants to get the F-, everyone wants to see it. So I think it also points to being able to update the data, look at trends, look at potential as well as the baselining aspects. But I guess a bit more bluntly, I think not only community engagement, I think there's a case for sort of advocacy, whether that's within the local community, to politicians, whether that's up to central government. I think possibly there's an interesting idea about whether it could be used with developers in some way if we move towards seeking developer contributions, not just around kind of traffic flow and congestion, but actually around some sense of carbon budget or quotas. That could be interesting. And I think finally, things like business case development and funding bids, this could be really helpful, and not least sharing good practice. So a bit of a rambling answer. I'm excited
that's great.
about
I think
this.
that's really, really useful. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think if we went through the list that Gillian put up in the beginning, for me, the monitoring function, I mean, the baseline function is obviously there. Where are we now? Or where were we in 2018? And of course, there is a huge amount of other data that could be added in terms of people have been asking about what about air quality and how does this link with the BICE data sets and so on and so forth. But I think that sort of idea about monitoring obviously does require that this tool does get updated, and we can come back to that in a minute. Similarly, there were lots of questions about Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, because we always seem to do this for England. And again, it's to do with the availability of data sets, but not without the realms of possibility. But one of the things I really like is the benchmarking bit of it, because it's sort of particularly that idea that you can sort of compare it with and I just wondered like how that conversation goes, Stephen, when you're trying to, sort of talk to you're being engaged as a consultant for a local authority, and they're like, oh, well, we can't do anything. And you're like, well, hang on a minute, this area is like yours, and, this is what can be done. Those difficult questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think being able to select by ONS output area classification really helps facilitate the comparison on areas that share similar place and socio-demographic type characteristics. There was a question or comment about could it not be using sort of things like Acorn or Mosaic data. But I think if we want this to remain sort of open source and free, that's some of the limitations of that. I think it's extremely helpful. People get a bit bored of being compared to Cambridge, for example, when we're talking about cycling mode shares. I gave a little demo to the team, apologies Malcolm, yesterday, and so I said no one wants to be too London centric, but I'd clicked on a LSA called Little London in Leeds. But I think having those comparisons are extremely helpful. Where I'd like to see this go next, if the funding's available, is looking at that benchmarking in terms of potential. So what are the characteristics of those areas that are doing better than their kind of like for like areas? I think that's extremely powerful in engagement. You're going to turn leaders off if you always compare things to central London or Cambridge or irrelevant, effectively, areas.
Yeah, I mean, you could literally compare neighbourhoods to neighbourhoods, and you could literally talk about, well, these areas, these are all rural areas, but actually some rural areas are doing better. I wonder whether it's almost like a capacity building tool, Gillian, that you could use to bring different sort of groups of authorities together where they know they've got a specific type of problem, and then sort of lobby government at the national level. Hang on a minute, look, we've all got this same problem with, I don't know, high reliance on cars in rural areas. We need something more strategic to happen at the national level.
I think so. I think, as I think you were inferring, it's not going to work so well to have use it as a blame game tool and sort of, look how good I am compared to you, or, look how bad you are. But there is a real positive element, which is the sharing of experience. And shared understanding of the problems, and as you say, maybe then shared strategies, and then sharing experience, best practice, etc., and developing networks. I think, you know, as well as what's just been said about not wanting to always compare to Cambridge, to London, etc., I really see the whole rural versus urban sort of what would you call it, passing the buck a little bit that happens in this debate, and you know, whereby rural areas in particular say, well, we can't do it, we haven't got any of this, you know, we've got to leave this all to the urban areas with better public transport and walking and cycling opportunities. Well, the fact of the matter is that doesn't cut it in terms of the carbon agenda. Everywhere has to act, and hopefully this type of tool will enable rural areas to compare themselves to rural areas and figure out what can be done much more constructively.
Yeah, I was also thinking, you know, it's a great way to argue with, for example, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government around the siting of houses, because in fact what's happening is we're putting all our new houses in these more peripheral places where public transport is awful, and then telling people not to use their cars. And so I think there's some quite big discussions that can be had between the business, the business department, the BICE, and DCLG and DFT and so forth, to try and bring those things together, because clearly what we're doing now is compartmentalizing it according to transport or housing or whatever. And this, I like the way that this tool brings it all together.
Yeah.
And Mark, at the level of your local authority, would you also say that you would be able to use this as a sort of like discussion point tool with people that are not just related to transport, but also the housing development plans and sort of regional planning?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, as we've identified, it can be used in a number of different contexts. I mean, the bit that we haven't explored today is the whole home heating challenge, which I think the tool really illustrates really well some of the challenges around home heating and moving forward, and talking to developers about when thinking about new homes and new installation of new homes, that, you know, the reasons why we need to move forward very quickly on the whole home heating issue, which again in rural areas is a really significant challenge, given that many homes rely on oil-fired heating. Mm. So yes, I think it helps us in those conversations again with members of the public, about home heating and how things need to change, but also thinking about developers and how we influence, new housing stock coming on stream, and the need to think about different ways of heating our homes.